Baker Mayfield and Mike Evans balled out last year and earned themselves a nice payday, but there's hope that they can be even better in their second season together. We discussed the 2024 fantasy outlook for the entire Buccaneers offense on today's episode of Locked On Fantasy Football.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NFL fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. I am one of your co-hosts, Michelle Magdziuk, and when I'm not doing this, I'm a researcher and fantasy analyst for NFL Network.
And I'm your other co-host, Vinnie Iyer, and I'm not doing this. I'm writing about NFL, fantasy, betting, everything you can imagine for sportingnews.com.
Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. We are going through all 32 teams, going through their entire offense and what we expect from them in terms of fantasy value in 2024. We made it almost through all of the NFC teams. We have two teams left, the Buccaneers and the Panthers. We're going to hit on the Buccaneers today. So last year, right, they signed Baker Mayfield to a one-year deal, and they're just like, let's just see what happens. It worked out pretty well. They made the playoffs. Their offense overall wasn't like crazy. They ranked 20th in points per game last season, 19th in fantasy points per game, but they did start to click towards the second half of the year. They re-signed Baker Mayfield and Mike Evans to big contracts. We saw Mike Evans ball out with Baker. They did lose their offensive coordinator, Dave Canales. So another change for Baker. And really the only additions they made to offense were in the draft, wide receiver Jalen McMillan in the third round, and then running back Bucky Irving in the fourth round. So let's start with, I think, the biggest fantasy player on this team, and it's Mike Evans, right? Let's start with these wide receivers. He finished as the wide receiver 8 in points per game last year in half PPR, wide receiver 5 overall. Do you expect him to have even a bigger year in his second season with Baker Mayfield?
Yeah, it's a little bit questionable. Right now, he's ranked at wide receiver 19, so that's a significant drop off there from where he produced last season. I think everyone's just expecting him as he gets older to eventually hit the wall. And we've seen it with AJ Green. We've seen it with Julio Jones. Once he hit 30 and he played a lot, and he's definitely played a lot. He's been as consistent as they get with the 1,000-yard seasons. Nobody's started as well in their career with that. So I think that's the expectations. Is it going to be the year? Is it going to happen now? But I think Baker Mayfield kind of rejuvenated him a little bit. He needed a quarterback there after Tom Brady that was going to keep feeding him the ball. And really, if you go back, I mean, it's consistent. James Winston, Tom Brady, Mayfield, it doesn't matter. I mean, Mike Evans gets it done. Really what is inconsistent about him is his catch rate. It can be up and down. So that says he's going to execute more big plays than not and touchdowns more than not in certain years. So really, there's not much that changes about Mike Evans. He keeps himself in great shape. He's still the go-to guy outside. Mayfield and him have great chemistry here. And I just think he is just too good right now. I think everyone knows where the ball's going, but he also does two things that are pretty big for fantasy. He makes up for inefficiency with like big catches, right? Those are going to help him get the yards. The other thing is he's always available in scoring position because of his size. So those two things, I think we look at it as wide receiver 19. That's pushing it near the wide receiver 2 situation, where I think wide receiver 2 is more his floor. And if he can get those touchdowns up, then you're looking at top 12 wide receiver 1.
Yeah, he's just a touchdown scorer, man. Like you look at 13 receiving touchdowns and you say, well, that's going to have to go down. But he's had 13 or more receiving touchdowns in 3 of the last 4 years. Like, I'm not going to be shocked if, again, he puts up at least 12 touchdowns. Like, that's just the type of player he is. And also, like you mentioned, those deep plays. He had the second most deep receiving touchdowns last year. That's 20 plus air yards, behind only Tyreek Hill, who had 8. Mike Evans had 7. Like, he's a big play machine. Now, the one thing about Mike Evans, and it's been like this pretty much his entire career, he's very, very inconsistent from week to week. Like, he'll give you those huge bomb weeks to win you weeks, and then the next game he'll kind of just do nothing. Like, there is a time he finished as a wide receiver 1, wide receiver 7, and then wide receiver 100. And then there's a week he finished as wide receiver 68, and a week he finished as wide receiver 55. So he definitely has those down weeks, but like, so maybe you pair him with a more safe wide receiver as the wide receiver 2. That's just more consistent from week to week. But Mike Evans is a great value at wide receiver 19. I'm not really sure why he's going so low. Like, he's going around guys like DJ Moore and Nico Collins. He's going after Deebo Samuel. Is there any world that you take Deebo Samuel over Mike Evans?
No, I mean he's a clear number one for his team, and we'll get into Chris Godwin in a moment. But yeah, there was a clear separation. Those guys used to be pretty tight, right? In their scoring and the end of the Jameis Winston era. Then Tom Brady kind of got Godwin going as kind of a slot inside guy, and then you had Evans kind of go in the other direction, right? So when I look at this, yeah, I mean there's clear separation here. I don't think Evans and Godwin are as tight as those other guys have to battle, like Nico Collins battling what Stephon Diggs has to do, or Deebo Samuel battling what Brandon Ayuk has to do. So, again, I think there's a little bit more separation with Evans and Godwin than people like to think.
Now, if Ayuk does get traded, maybe that changes
Yeah.
things to Deebo Samuel. But I really like Mike Evans' value this year. He's great at that cost. Now, with Chris Godwin, it wasn't a very good year. He had a couple good games to end the season, but finished as wide receiver 38 in points per game. His cost this year is actually more than that. It went up to wide receiver 33, 65th overall. I'm personally shocked that his cost isn't lower because of just what a disappointing year it was last year. Like, his overall numbers don't look that bad in terms of receiving yards. Like, he led the team shockingly with 83 receptions, had over 1,000 receiving yards. The biggest issue is the 2 receiving touchdowns, and like his target share and his receptions and receiving yards per game and yards per reception, those all went up towards the end of the year. So do you think Godwin will be more like he was over the last 4 weeks of the season, or just kind of staying away at that cost?
Yeah, I mean, we're still looking at his chemistry developing with Baker Mayfield a little bit. I mean, it's pretty well established with Winston and helped him as a breakout guy with Brady. We knew that Brady likes to throw to the slot a lot, and he got Godwin kind of going there as a big kind of volume possession guy that we've seen in the past in New England. So I think Chris Godwin, I don't have too much interest because I don't think his value is going to go up too much from a wide receiver 3, where I do see Evans having a little bit more wide receiver 1 type upside.
Yeah, like looking at Chris Godwin, he's gone right in the middle of Terry McLaurin and Jaden Reed. I would much prefer both of those guys. But let me ask you some other questions here.
Yeah.
Would you rather Chris Godwin or Calvin Ridley, who's just going a few picks after him?
Yeah, I think I would go Calvin Ridley. He has a little bit more upside in that Titans offense. It's a little bit different right now, right? More big plays that are going to come. So, yeah, I don't know if I trust DeAndre Hopkins to stay healthy as he gets older as well, and the receiving options there. So Godwin, again, his time has been good. And keep in mind, he's also getting up there as well. So he's going to slow down a bit. And they both played a lot again. But I think Evans has kind of a cheat code out of it with his big plays and touchdowns.
I will say this next one I'm going to ask you, they're pretty much the same type of player. I feel like Chris Godwin and Christian Kirk. I think Godwin's a bit more talented overall, but I actually would like Christian Kirk more for fantasy this year. He has a chance to be the wide receiver 1 for the Jaguars. We've seen it before as well. And I don't think Godwin has that chance with Mike Evans if Evans stays healthy. So I would go with Christian Kirk over Godwin. Would you agree with me, or go with the other side?
No, I would go with you there. I mean, I think you have to look at in the slot is Godwin. And keep in mind, he didn't play a lot of slot last year, and that was a little bit of his difficulty as well, where they had to transition their personnel. Well, Kirk is kind of a slot-first type offense. I think they go inside to outside there. In Jacksonville, same thing we do. In Detroit, where the slot receiver, Amon-Ra St. Brown, is the dominant force there. So when you look at that, I don't think that's the kind of Godwin, again, you're going to get ever again.
Yeah, I agree with you there. So that's really it with the Buccaneers wide receiver group, right? Like, those are going to be the top 2 targets in the offense. We know that they're going to get the majority of the targets, but Mike Evans just has that star potential. Well, I just don't think Chris Godwin with Baker Mayfield fits that same mold here. We're going to get into the Buccaneers backfield in our next segment because Rachaad White was not good in terms of NFL play last year, but was actually a really solid fantasy player. We'll discuss if we like his value for this upcoming season. This episode of Locked On Fantasy Football is brought to you by the Game Time app. Buying tickets to your favorite events should not be stressful. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. With killer deals on last-minute tickets and their best price guarantee, you can stop stressing over the tickets and start getting hyped for the fun that you'll have. I have used this app so many times because they're so easy to use and always reliable. They're the fastest growing ticketing app in the country for a reason. Get images of your seat before you buy so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. Buy tickets in a matter of seconds, 2 taps, and you're set. And tickets are sent directly to your phone so you never have to dig through your email. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Again, that's code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Terms do apply. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Rachaad White, he finishes as an RB6 overall last year. Now, a big part of that is because he played the full 17 games. And when you're a running back and play full 17 games, it's going to up your ranking there. He finishes RB14 in points per game in half PPR leagues, but the second half of the season was better, running back 8 in points per game from week 7 through 18. Listen, so they didn't really add anyone to this backfield, and we both thought they were going to. They added Bucky Irving in the 4th round. I don't know if that worries us enough. Bucky Irving is a smaller back, but he is a receiving back as well. We know White's inefficient on the ground, but does that matter? Do you think his target share is safe this year behind just Evans and Godwin?
Yeah, I think he's an integral part to what they want to do. And Rachaad White, keep in mind, he was looking good in the playoffs as well. Like, he seemed to get better as a runner and producer as the season went on. Before it was like, he's getting by with his cheap checkdowns, receptions. He was kind of the reverse Alvin Kamara. We talked about him with the Saints, where there was a lot of checkdowns with him early, and then they kind of opened up the offense. With Rachaad White, they kind of checked down to him a lot early, and then later he scored more and pulled off more rushing efficiency there as they kind of spread the ball around. So when I look at that, Rachaad White is still going to be a key part. And they had multiple opportunities, Michelle. We know how good they're decent, this free agent class. I mean, you have Josh Jacobs and Saquon Barkley. They were not interested in going after any of those guys. They didn't have any interest in stashing Jonathan Brooks. They end up with Bucky Irving, and that's a good sign. If they'd gotten kind of a power back with Rachaad White, I think that would have been bad for him. But as you mentioned, Bucky Irving is the smaller back, known for his receiving change of pace. So that says they like Rachaad White in a key role. They just want a guy that can get a handful of touches in those passing situations. So everything that the team has done, the talent, the production down the stretch, all that points to Rachaad White. Right now, he's at RB13. I think that's fair. 42nd overall on the board. I mean, that's a bit aggressive. I might take some wide receivers ahead of him, but I'd say he is a borderline RB1, RB2. That's where I look at him, anywhere in that 11 to 15 range. And I think that's just about right for him.
I think so as well. I do think his target share is pretty stable. Now, maybe Bucky Irving comes in the second half of the year and gets more, receiving work. I don't think he's going to steal any of the goal line work. Like, that should still be Rachaad White's job, because again, Bucky Irving's 195 pounds at 5'10". Like, he's not going to be the goal line back. So when they get around there, it will be Rachaad White. Baker's not going to steal too many rushing touchdowns either. So he scored 9 touchdowns last year. I expect that to be about the same. Maybe he can even put in a couple more. So yeah. I do think his price at RB13 is pretty fair, right? RB14 in points per game last year. When it's fair when you look at him compared to other running backs. However, his 42nd overall cost, and you're looking at the wide receivers and the tight ends and the quarterbacks going around him, I'm not quite sure he's going to be on my team, because, like, are you taking Rachaad White or Trey McBride? They're going back to back in drafts right now.
Yeah, I think you go for a little bit more upside the other positions at wide receiver, tight end at that spot. I mean, I think we've talked about a little bit where the backs kind of in that borderline range. We're going RB1, RB2. There's a lot of like similar value there. So that's what you have to look at. You look at 2 contexts for White. One is with the other running backs. Okay, it's about the same. But wait, these other players at these other positions are better in relation to what you can get later. There are a few picks later where I think you can get a back somewhat similar to White, just a few picks later at that position. So that's what you have to kind of weigh here for sure. And I think he's one of those classic picks where don't force yourself into running back at any point. Get the best values on the board. And make sure that he's the best value versus what's out there before you draft him.
Yeah, because looking at where he's going, Lamar Jackson, Trey McBride, Malik Neighbors, Amari Cooper, Zay Flowers, Mark Andrews are all right there. And I think value-wise, Rachaad White would probably be the worst in that group. Now, let's say you are going to take a running back in this area. You decided on it, right? Would you rather Rachaad White or James Cook? Because they're going very similar draft costs right now.
Yeah, I like the upside of James Cook a little bit more, and I think he's just a better player, the talent-wise, than Rachaad White. So, and you saw the Joe Brady offense last year was James Cook as a centerpiece of that. So, trust a little bit more. Keep in mind you do have the transition from Dave Canales to Liam Cohen. So, a few things that are variable there in that offense.
Yeah, I agree with you. I would go with James Cook. Now, we talked about Alvin Kamara yesterday on yesterday's show when we covered the Saints. Would you rather Rachaad White or Alvin Kamara? Pretty similar playing styles right now.
Oh, easily. I think I go Rachaad White. I mean, he's younger. He's got more upside. He's the key. He's not threatened by anybody in that backfield. So, yeah, I like him. And then we talked about Bucky Irving a little bit. I like the fact that he's a receiving back, right? If something were to happen to Rachaad White, you can get some cheap half-point, full PPR value probably from Bucky Irving, but maybe later in the year more so than early. They did have Chase Edmonds lingering around. So, I don't know. Like, Rachaad White is great, but maybe you can get really cheap.
It is interesting to me they didn't add anybody because the Buccaneers recorded the minus 231 rushing yards over expectation last year, according to Next Gen Stats. That was the worst in the NFL. Only team that had worse than minus 120. So they're almost double worse than anybody else. And a part of that is Rachaad White because he is just such a better receiving back than he is a running back. But he's going to get the workload again. And we take volume, right? Like we're open to volume for these fantasy players. It doesn't really matter how they get it done. With Bucky Irving, if he was just a little bit bigger and he's not on the fast side either, ran a slower 40. He does look like he plays faster than that. But he led Oregon in rushing yards and rushing touchdowns last year. He was also the only Power 5 player with 1,000 rushing yards and 400 receiving yards. So he can be that dual threat running back. I just don't know how much playing time he'll get in his rookie season. His Bucky Irving's ADP right now is running back 56, 169th overall. So like in normal drafts, he's probably not going to get taken. Maybe in some deeper drafts or dynasty drafts, he will. Any interest in taking Bucky Irving late in deep drafts?
Yeah, I think my only interest is if I do have Rachaad White, and that's where I'm going to look at it. But standalone, not going to be all that interested. He's not one of the higher lottery tickets. He's the better kind of insurance policy than trying to hit a home run with a rookie back.
Yeah, I agree with you. Okay, so in our final segment, we have to hit on Baker Mayfield because he was somewhat decent for fantasy last year. We were not expecting that. And then also we'll cover your boy Cade Otton to finish up the Buccaneers. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Have to turn down the volume with all that shouting. Make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news. Streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So Baker Mayfield gets signed on a 1-year, $4 million deal. It's just like, we'll give you a shot to start here because we have no other options, right? And he comes through. He had a career high season in passing yards and passing touchdowns. And he looked good, especially towards the second half of the season. He finishes as the quarterback 19 in points per game last year. That was the same amount as Matthew Stafford. So no, it's not like an exciting finish, but towards the end of the year, he finishes quarterback, or this is the second half of the season, quarterback 8, 10, 20, 13, 20, 12, 2, 14, 13. So like some really solid finishes throughout that second half of the year. Do you think Baker can get better in his second season now that he's in a stable environment?
Yeah, again, this is a quarterback, and he's in a group of quarterbacks that including Matthew Stafford, including the quarterback we talked about with Derek Carr, is not going to give you much in the running game. So that puts him a little bit behind already with some of the guys that can produce in that sense. And now he's a pretty good athlete, but that's not what he does. He throws the ball, and that's how he's going to have to get most of his points. He's going to have his share of interceptions. I mean, he's cut down on them of late when transitioning to the Bucs and having the influence of Dave Canales. But now Canales is gone, so it's yet another coordinator for him. I don't know if it's the thing that happens, right? That Dave Canales helps Geno Smith become a quarterbacks coach, and then he goes on to the next one, and they have diminishing returns. So if you're following that around, you might have more interest in Bryce Young now with Canales being the head coach of the Panthers. But Mayfield, I think, is a veteran at this point where he's settled, and you did put the notes here that Liam Cohen has some experience with him, and keep in mind that's when Baker had this little crazy run with the Rams with that comeback victory against the Raiders and all that good stuff there. It was a feel-good story, absorbing the playbook pretty quickly. So I think he's fine. I just don't think you can go too much more because he's not going to give you running ability. I love him in Superflex and 2 QB leagues as your second QB. He's going to give you pretty consistent value. He's got the weapons. So, again, it's just about right. Maybe a little bit low at QB 22. I think it's more status quo. So I see him more as QB 15 to 18 this year based on the scoring.
Yeah, I don't think he's going to be a consistent scorer where you're going to feel good about plugging him in from week to week to week. Like, he's a perfect streaming quarterback when he has good matchups. He can beat up on teams. Like, Baker Mayfield is a very, very talented quarterback. He has a strong arm. He has good weapons. Like, he can get it done. He's just, I mean, if you go through the timeline of his career and what he's been put through, it is pretty crazy, right? He's had 7 different offensive coordinators now in his career, the most by any player over the first 6 seasons since the NFL merger. But, and again, like, I know Liam Cohen, he already played with 4 games, but still another new offensive coordinator because Dave Canales leaves. Yeah. So it's not a great start to his career, but I do think you started to see signs of him getting comfortable with this team and with these playmakers in the second half of the year. And then in the playoffs, he throws for 300 passing yards and 3 touchdowns in both the playoff games. Like, he does have potential to be a top 12 fantasy quarterback, but I think like that's his limit, right? Is quarterback 12. I'm not sure it's going to go too much higher than that. Again, in one quarterback league, it's probably not going to be interested in him, but in Superflex, in 2 quarterback leagues, he does have value there. So looking at his draft cost, it's quarterback 22. He's going right around Aaron Rodgers, Deshaun Watson, Geno Smith. Would you rather Baker Mayfield or Geno Smith this season?
I think definitely Baker Mayfield. I don't know. There's some fade going on with Geno, so I'm a little bit afraid of that.
Yeah, I'm going Baker there. What about Baker or Aaron Rodgers?
I think I'm going to go with Aaron Rodgers, but purely by reputation. Would not scare me or surprise me, I would say, if Baker has more points than Rodgers at the end.
Yeah, I lean Aaron Rodgers too, but I'm with you. If I had a bet, I feel like Baker would have more points. So I don't know why I go that way. We just know Aaron Rodgers has such a higher ceiling. And then one more, the guy who took his job, Deshaun Watson or Baker Mayfield.
Yeah, I don't know if the Browns should feel great about this one. If they're getting the same type of fantasy production that is reality production as well. I mean, they had to get in the playoffs with Joe Flacco last year. So I don't know. This was a tough one. I'm going to say Watson barely because he can run, and that's it.
Yeah, I think Watson's probably a top 12 fantasy quarterback this year, and we know he has top 5 upside. So I'm going to go with Watson as well over Baker, but Baker's a nice value at this cost in a 2 quarterback league around these guys. Like, even Will Levis is going right around him. I would much rather Baker Mayfield. So you can get, if you draft him as a second quarterback, I think that's a really nice, safe way to go. Now, Cade Otton, he's coming into his 3rd season, maybe a 3rd-year breakout for him. He finished as tight end 22 in points per game last year. He only scored more than 8 fantasy points in one game, right? He had one good game pretty much the entire year, and the rest of the year was pointless. But they do have that wide open spot for like a 3rd target. Last year it was Rachaad White. Maybe that's him again. But if they wanted to get him more involved, there is space for him. Do you think he can do that 3rd-year breakout, or he's just this type of tight end that's always going to be, barely putting up any fantasy points?
Well, it's a different type of offense. And the other thing we know from Dave Canales, you didn't see much tight end production there in Seattle or Tampa. Liam Cohen, I guess he did have Tyler Higbee for a short time. And we know how Higbee went, right? If they were hurting for some targets and they were limited, that's when Higbee would produce. But if they had enough guys and producing a 3-receiver, 11 personnel sets, they wouldn't really throw to Tyler Higbee all that much. So I think that's what you have to look at. What was Tyler Higbee just a few years ago? You might look at him, and that might just say we're adding it up back to a tight end 2. So I think he's a tight end 2, but he has some intrigue again. They're sorting out some receivers. We'll get into them. They added Jalen McMillan, who I really like out of Washington in the draft. We'll see if he can carve out a slot spot. Trey Palmer was kind of an occasional guy. Emerson Mayfield, but nothing consistent. They just also took a flyer at Sterling Shepard. So, as you know, they don't have a lot at wide receiver behind Evans and Godwin. So, it just comes down to will Otten see those looks a little bit more. I think he's gotten better. So I think they would say he's a pretty good athlete. He was very good at Washington, that they're going to get him involved more, I think, just because of the nature, the inexperience they have at the other wide receivers.
Would you rather take a shot on a third-year breakout for Cade Otton or a second-year breakout for Luke Musgrave?
Well, one thing Cade Otton doesn't have to do is deal with another good tight end. So you have Tucker Kraft there, and keep in mind, they plugged in Kraft, and he was productive when Musgrave was out. So I think I go with Otton. I think he has a better chance to score more touchdowns.
I think I'd go Musgrave. I know you're a big Cade Otton fan. I don't see the breakout happening for him. So I'm going to stay away from Cade Otton. Again, I bring up his name every episode, it feels like, but Juwan Johnson. If I'm waiting that late for a tight end, or if I'm in a 2 tight end league and I need another tight end late, it's Juwan Johnson, and they're going right around each other. That is it for today's show. Thank you to you all for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. Every dayers, our next episode will be finishing up the NFC teams. We will finish with the Carolina Panthers. Don't miss it. Bye, y'all.